going to get started, but before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which NCEAS is located and who's hosting this talk today. We pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. As we come together today to bring awareness to issues of equity and justice, we recognize the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. I'm really excited to have everyone join us and welcome you to this third of our series of talks. I just want to say just a few words about the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCEAS, which is hosting these talks. I'm the director. My name is Ben Halpern, and NCEAS is based at UC Santa Barbara in Santa Barbara, California. We welcome those who are joining from out of town and out of state. It's great to have you here. NCEAS is a synthesis center that's focused on bringing together data, people, ideas, tools, knowledge to help us accelerate discovery in the ecological and environmental science space. And we are increasingly making sure that our focus is inclusive of the many ways that people think about ideas, data, and knowledge, and also the questions that are important to ask in the space of environmental science. And that is part of what has motivated our interest in hosting this series. So it's really great to have everyone here. If you don't know much about NCEAS, please have a look at our website and learn a little bit more. And I'll pass it off now to Caitlin to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks to everyone for joining. It looks like we've got a good crowd. Just a couple of housekeeping points. There is captioning available. You can turn that on at the bottom. This will be recorded and put on YouTube, and we'll email all of you a link later this week. The recordings you can share with colleagues who can't make it, or if you need to duck out early. And we'll be doing a Q&A, moderated Q&A at the end, and you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom, there's a Q&A button. You can put your questions in there as they come up throughout the talk, and then I will be moderating a question and answer at the end. All of you are muted and your videos are off in the webinar format. Fortunately, we can't see you all, but we will be able to read your questions. The chat is also only accessible to the panelists, and please try not to put your questions there just so we can stay organized. But if you have any comments or anything you'd like to pass along to Dr. Jennings, we'll be sharing that chat with her after the talk. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Lydia Jennings, a transdisciplinary scholar who braids together the fields of soil ecology, environmental law, and American Indian studies. Dr. Jennings is a postdoctoral researcher in community environment and policy at the University of Arizona, where she also earned her PhD in environmental sciences. And she's been recognized for her contributions to science as an NSF Graduate Fellow, AGU Voices for Science Fellow, a Native Nations Institute Indigenous Data Sovereignty Fellow, and was awarded the Rising Leader Award from the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. Dr. Jennings is also committed to activism and outreach within and outside of scientific communities. And I encourage you all to check out her website, learn more about how she blends art and science, works with youth, and for resources on topics like tribal engagement and land acknowledgements, which I think we'll hear more about today. Dr. Jennings is also an avid runner. I was really impressed to see just a couple weeks ago completed a 50-mile run in honor of Indigenous scientists to raise funds for Indigenous students whose education has been impacted by the pandemic. She's truly an inspiration, and it is an honor to have her join us today. And although we can't give her a loud and warm welcome that she deserves, please join me in spirit as I welcome Dr. Jennings to NCEAS. And I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you so much for highlighting so many points there. And hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here to present really these merging of my own passions, but also a lot of the work of my research collaborative. And so I am a postdoctoral researcher with the Collaborative for Indigenous Data Governance. I'm coming to you today from the traditional lands of Lenape Nation, as well as my own tribe, the Pasco Yaqui tribes. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, I think it's really important to kind of center and really talk about my own relationship with these topics and why it's important. So I'm a citizen of the Pascua-Yaqui tribe. I've really been taught throughout my life, don't tell me what you know until I know who you are. And so to let you know who I am a daughter. My mother is also Huichol or Wirikuta tribe. My dad is Pascua-Yaqui. I'm a daughter, a sister, a fur mama. As many mentioned, I'm also a really avid trail runner and trained as a soil microbiologist. And really, my relationship with the land and land stewardship is really vital to both my professional and personal livelihoods. So as I go over my presentation today, I really want to kind of talk around about this background of land stewardship, talking about Indigenous data sovereignty versus Indigenous data governance, and then also thinking forward of how can we as researchers continue to work with Indigenous communities, particularly supporting Indigenous data sovereignty. So I think before we begin talking about how we can move forward, we have to really acknowledge the past. And there have been many US policies really instrumental in removing Indigenous peoples from our homelands. So that starts with the United States inception of Manifest Destiny, this notion of pushing forward Christianity and capitalism and really removing Indigenous peoples from our lands. And that was executed through federal policies like the Indigenous Removal Act, the Homestead Act, which really brought in many settler colonials into newly free lands that Native people have been removed from. And then also through the general mining law, the last community held lands that were available were then further separated out through the Dawes Allotment Act, and any kind of outdoor spaces that were made into public lands. Those are really separate. The 1964 Wilderness Act, and more recently the Hopi and Navajo Relocation Act. So many of these started the country's inception, but continue to have continue to be very enduring policies today. So as a general reminder, the United States took more than 2 billion acres of land stewarded by Indigenous peoples through treaty or forced removal. And many of these federal policies really broke up community-held tribal lands and attempted to erase land-based knowledge systems vital to ecological management. And so it's really important as we do land acknowledgements that we recognize the land stewards of the past, present, and future. Because as an Indigenous researcher and studying environmental issues, it's really our existence here is a political act, or research is a political act. And so today, tribal reservations can span anywhere from less than 20 acres, like my own tribal nation, to the vast size, like something like the Navajo Nation. And so collectively, tribal governments now hold less than 50 million acres of land, a fraction of our original Aboriginal land holdings. The many nations continue to have enduring relationships with the lands that are now public lands, and others really fight for recognition and access to their traditional homelands. And so in this process, it's really important to recognize these inherent sovereignties of both recognized and non-recognized Indigenous peoples. And recognizing that recognition alone is really an important part of that political power. Now, I think another part that's really important, and many of us definitely have interest in here as ecological scientists, is really recognizing how Indigenous land stewardship is vital to biodiversity. So this is a figure from Nature, it came out a few years ago, or I guess quite a few years ago now, but really looking at biodiversity measurements globally, but also in different continents, comparing Indigenous managed land versus those of protected and natural managed lands. And in all of these continents, and globally, we see that Indigenous managed lands have the highest levels of biodiversity. This has been further supported with the UN, several UN studies. It's recognized that Indigenous peoples manage less than a quarter of the Earth's land base, but within that land base lies 80% of global biodiversity. A study that came out in 2019 recognized that Indigenous managed lands have higher rare species richness, less deforestation, and less land degradation. And so while Indigenous peoples are esteemed for our contributions to the protection of biological diversity, many Native nations continue to be challenged and continuing today to protect tribal self-determination, these cultural stewardship practices and interests on both federal public lands, and just fighting for recognition to those lands globally. Now, as we talk about Indigenous populations globally, let's talk about how abundant Indigenous peoples are. So there's over 5,000 cultures worldwide, over 370 million Indigenous peoples. Now, officially, there's not a definition for what Indigenous is, and that part of that I think really is political, but there is a general understanding that Indigenous peoples have a self-identification that is both on the individual level as well as the community level. We've been existing in our communities and having historical continuity pre-colonial contact. Many may continue to maintain strong links to territories surrounding natural resources or natural kin. We have distinct social, economic, political systems, languages, cultures, and belief systems. And so there's a strong desire also maintaining this Indigenous identity to reproduce and protect our ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and protecting that for the future of our future generations. And I think one of the things that's really important to think about in this definition as well is that when you're in a place where Indigenous peoples are the majority, there can often be multiple Indigenous groups. And so it's really also to recognize that within these groups, there can be multiple communities that have been colonized to different degrees, abused or repressed to different degrees, and thinking about how our different systems continue to colonize. And so I think a great example of that is Botswana. There's 7 different Indigenous tribes there, but one tribe was really chosen to really make their national language, right? So I just want to talk about there are varying degrees that both within and outside that Indigenous peoples exist. And most of the presentation I'll be doing today is really pertaining to the United States. So I just want to take a second to recognize that we have 567 federally recognized tribes, some state recognized, some that are non-recognized. And so really we're a broad group. Now, as we move forward, I also want to talk about data because that's really what we're all here is to think about data. And so trained as an environmental scientist, an ecologist, we really think about data in terms of measurements or statistics used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, calculation, and modeling, right? And we collect data constantly, whether that's from our Twitter feed, from our financial records, or from our field measurements. But how is data reflecting power inequities? How is it being used by governments, industry, or non-governmental organizations? And who can get access to that data? So I want to take a second now to also talk about Indigenous data. And so really Indigenous data is any information, any format or content that impacts Indigenous lives on the collective and individual levels. So that can include information about our environment and natural resources. I can talk about our demographic data, our social and health data, or our data about us as nations, our traditional and cultural information, our archives, our oral histories. And so really there's a range. And I want to also compare in how we think about Indigenous data from kind of the typical standard method we've been trained as scientists versus Indigenous science. And so going through academia, I was very much trained in the settler colonial science practices, thinking that our science is very quantitative, that our observations are made by a small group of highly trained professionals, often those with PhDs or master's degrees, that our data is synchronic data, observations from a range of sites, but really lack long-term perspectives, with exceptions of something like the Harvard forest, right? We also tend to be trained to think that our data is value-free, and I think more increasingly we're having conversations of recognizing that all of our data has some type of bias from our own backgrounds. And then also thinking about how knowledge that we generate is held by individuals or institutions or data repositories. Now, when we think about Indigenous data science practices and traditional ecological knowledges, data is both quantitative and qualitative. Not only are you counting the number of salmon or herd in the area, but you're also thinking about oral histories and how those tell specific types of stories and are really valuable science practices. Some of the primary collectors of the data tend to be observers and resource users. So thinking of hunters, fishermen, gathering traditions. Data is also very recognized as being diachronic data. So typically at a single locale over a long time. And we're talking long time, we're talking 7 generations or longer, right? It's very well recognized in Indigenous communities that data is subjective. It does have an associated value because how good your data is might determine if your community can eat, if your community can have access to specific medicines. So it does have very important uses. And then also knowing that knowledge is held as a collective. And we talked a little bit earlier of how some of those federal policies really disrupted kind of collective land management of areas, but that's also really true of knowledge being held as a collective and instead being more privatized. So as traditional ecological knowledge is increasingly being sought by academics and agency scientists as a potential source of ideas for emerging models of ecosystem management or ecological restoration, it's really important to recognize that these kind of differing perspectives of science have historically done some damage in not valuing traditional ecological and science practices. I really appreciate how projects like the Neon Biorepository at ASU and others are acknowledging how they've dismissed those knowledges in the past as a ways that we can really continue to move forward and really braid these knowledge systems together. And so I want to give a couple of examples in my own experience of these different knowledge systems. So being a Yaqui Yoma woman, really thinking about the value of oral history and also our data governance within that. So knowing that certain oral histories only go from man to man or woman to woman. I have friends who are from the Dene and Navajo Nation, and they talk about only specific stories can be told at certain times of years. And that's a really important part of that data governance and culture of data that they already have within them. Another example is really the importance of basket makers and traditional practitioners in informing some of the natural resource management. And so this is from the Tohono Nation. They make these really beautiful baskets from reeds that grow along the river. And it's been the cultural practitioners that first alerted about some water quality issues because the reeds, which they have to bend to make these baskets, were actually not bending enough. And it was connected to an area where there is reclaimed water versus pure and fresh water. And so that really then changed some of the practice of the Natural Resource Department. Another one of my favorite examples is really looking at how cultural practices such as beading of the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe are actually informing how plants have been changing over time, partially linked to climate change. And so this particular beater, Jessica Goki, is working, I believe, with the University of Minnesota climate scientist and kind of creating these repositories of what plants are currently there, but then they're also looking at traditional beadwork and how it's changed over time, and particularly in relation to what plants are present. So in a sense, this beadwork is really has been the first naturalist guide of the region. And so those kind of really vital ways that cultural practices are informing data. Now, as has been mentioned, I'm a very avid trail runner. And so I also think about knowing the names of the places we work and recreate with, and how those really inform us about the knowledge of those who have always stewarded them. So this mountain range is called the Santa Rita Mountains. That's a Spanish colonial name, right? Named after the day the saints, named after the day the Catholics really settled into this area and after specific saints. But the Tohono Nation, who've always stewarded this area, have a name that represents Long Mountain. And in fact, this mountain range is around 49 miles. And then my own tribal nation, we have a name around traditional medicine plant that grows in this region. So thinking about how those names really tell us about the ecology of these vital places. I also think it's important to note that some communities don't want to share those names, and that's a way of safeguarding their data. And it's important that we respect that as that's a vital part of their sovereignty and sovereignty governance. And so now let's talk about what sovereignty is, because I know as a Native person, that's very common in my language, but not for everyone else. And so generally in the United States, tribal sovereignty refers to the rights of tribal nations to govern themselves. These are granted by the US Constitution, treaties, court cases, and reaffirmed in Supreme Court cases, such as last year's McGritt versus Oklahoma. But what does sovereignty mean? It means that Native nations are responsible for what happens on their lands. It's not all or nothing. It may be in some high governmental domains and low in others, and this responsibility can be shared. However you do it though, you must do it responsibly. And it's inherently linked to self-determination, which is really the extent of a nation to make and enforce its own rules, resolve disputes, or problem solve when rules don't work as well as the people might like, as well as really establishing its own governing institutions, which takes us to think about governance, because that's a really vital part of data sovereignty and self-determination as well. And so that's that systems of values, policies, and institutions by which a society manages its economic, political, and social affairs. Of course, governance is executed through government, right? And the different organization structures associated with that. So as we think about those terms and really reflect back to data sovereignty, data governance. And so more mainstream, we think of data sovereignty as a concept that information which has been converted and stored in binary form is subject to the laws of the country in which it's located, really recognizing how data sovereignty is geographically bound digital information. And data governance refers to the ownership, collection, control, and analysis of that data. So thinking of corporate ownership, something like Facebook or Cambridge Analytica that really highlighted those differences of data sovereignty and data governance. But when we talk about data sovereignty and data governance for Indigenous nations, we have to reframe it back to these positions within tribal sovereignty. So these federal and state recognition, these court cases, these treaties. And so it's really important that when we think about, unrecognized tribal nations, both domestically as well as internationally, how those are inherently tied to power, and that those can be very intentional in thinking about those resources. It's also important that these rights, that we recognize these rights, are supported by United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, as well as been endorsed by the Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. So when we see these aspects of Indigenous data sovereignty and its desire to use data in ways that support and enhance the collective well-being and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Now, coming back to data sovereignty, how is that put into practice? So again, it's really derived from these inherent rights of people to govern their lands. That can be through tribal codes, through tribal policy. It can be, rooted into traditional roles like storytelling, as I mentioned, or kind of ceremonies around planting certain plants, for example. But it's also really positioned within these human rights frameworks and court cases. And so I think Nayoka Protocol is one particularly important for us as environmental scientists to really think about, as well as the UN Convention on Biodiversity. And then also how this knowledge is connected on both, collected on both a fundamental being of who we are as people, and how do we as scientists reallocate that authority of data back to Indigenous peoples. And so I actually want to give a couple of examples how Indigenous nations are leading the scientific inquiry process to support their own sovereignty. Now, there's a group of researchers up in Minnesota from the Fond du Lac tribal nation, and they have had, over the years, they've had a lot of issues with both copper mines, the Polymet copper mine, and oil pipelines really threatening their nation and their traditional food, which is mananulam wild rice. And so what they've begun doing is they've done partnerships with both their tribal college and the University of Minnesota to really train their community members to be able to do environmental assessments, because they've had so many issues in the past where they're not recognizing traditional ecological knowledge in the environmental assessment process. And so they're building that expertise within their own community, which I think is really powerful. And really highlights the importance of scientific evidence when it's paired with traditional ecological knowledge and oral history systems. And can really delineate these corporate tribal conversations about something like mineral development. Another example I think is really powerful is this co-development of protocols of collaborative consent. This is an example out of Canada where the Ministry of Forestry has been working with First Nation tribes over what they call the 4 R's framework of respect, relevance, responsibility, and reciprocity. Not only in recognizing Indigenous rights, but also how they consult, how they monitor outcomes and what they want monitored, and then how they share that data. And so I think this is really important because this method of collaborative consent has actually resulted in 33 consent-driven approaches of future Indigenous or forestry-related projects and contractual agreements between the First Nations and the British Columbian government. Now let's talk about Indigenous data governance. Again, this is a way a society organizes itself to make and implement decisions. And so this is a big figure, but I really want us to think about the data paradigm, this hierarchy of Indigenous data. And what I want to highlight is these colors in gray are kind of like current frameworks, and these colors in teal are really where we want to start striving for. And so currently we're in a state of data dependency where Indigenous data and tribal data systems have long been suppressed or usurped to meet others' needs and desires. So thinking about federal government reporting requirements or who's asking the questions in research. At the very tippy top, by us with them, is where we really want to see ourselves going. Where Indigenous scholars, both in academic and traditional, are leading the way in creating data knowledge systems and information, with the ultimate goal of doing co-production of data to drive federal policy. As researchers, we strive to be in the top 3 layers, but realistically, we have to be active in all of these data spheres. And so building and maintaining partnerships, both tribal and non-tribal, are really important, as well as empowering young people and cultural advisors. A couple of examples of that data governance structure and hierarchy in place is this work by my colleague, Dominique David Chavez, who really worked in her PhD at looking at doing an evaluation of over 20 years of climate studies and how they included Indigenous knowledge within that research. And so similar to that last figure, that paradigm, what we see is kind of this scale. The more blue they are, the more Indigenous centered they are, the less blue they are, the more colonial structural they are, extractive they are. And so really looking at extractive versus self-determined research. And what was fascinating, what she found, is that the vast majority of climate studies, 87%, were really more in this extractive model, and how that really talks about the power imbalances as we look at climate studies and climate research, and how we really want to move towards this more Indigenous research governance oriented scholarship, particularly as we look at how climate change is inequitably impacting Indigenous peoples. And so I really want to highlight that I think many should be including and reading this paper, because I think it's just so fascinating, and I could spend a lot longer on it today than I'm going to. The next part I want to talk about is how we're using different digital technologies to really ensure the protection of those data. So one are the local context traditional knowledge labels. And these are digital tags that ensure protocols travel with the data to maintain our connection to the data through provincial tagging, as well as reflecting the general purposes being permissioned. And so this is a really great program to look at, potentially use in some of your future research, and you can have such a range of tags. Another tool that's also been used or is being developed is Mukutu, which is developed with Kim Christensen and Craig Dietrich. It's a free, mobile, and open source platform built with Indigenous communities to manage and share digital cultural heritage. This is really a grassroots project aimed to empower communities to manage, share, narrate, and exchange their digital heritage in culturally relevant, ethically minded ways. So now the next part I want to think is, how do we put Indigenous data governance into practice? And so again, coming back to these ideas, the importance of law, both common, UNDRIP, and tribal law, policy, and these governmental institutions. So organizations and funding organizations are really particularly adapting to this. And I think that's a continuing important way to support Indigenous data governance, but also ethics. So thinking about when you do an internal review board training, including this Indigenous data governance is part of that. Also using metadata tables and labels, much like the traditional knowledge labels, and then also infrastructure, so data standards and programming needs. And so I just want to share that one of our collaborators, Kim Christensen, has often talked about the need. There's such a big need to process many of these materials that have been collected through colonial missions, but it has to be guided by the expertise of tribal nations. And we're also seeing that federal repositories want to give data back, but there has to be, there's this question of where do communities store the data? What is the training capacity to receive these data? And so that's really also led to the development of what we call the FAIR and CARE principles. These are principles that were established by my research group. The FAIR principles, really thinking about how these Indigenous data have a responsibility, or those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share data that are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and for collective benefit. And that requires accountability for meaningful and openly available data evidence of these efforts to really benefit Indigenous people. And so these FAIR principles really mean making your research findable, accessible, interpretable, especially in the cultural and language content, and as well as reusable to the communities in which your research is on and about and for. And that really led to the development of these CARE principles, particularly around Indigenous data governance. And these were drafted by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which really helps to think about the collective benefits, particularly of big data sources and open source data, the authority to control, as well as the responsibility and ethics of those that really generate this data. And so increasingly recognizing how Indigenous communities access to data and care of data decreases digital colonization. And so I think anytime we're working with this data, it's really important to think about how this data is impacting community, both on an individual as well as collective identity. And then also thinking about the relational responsibilities to Indigenous communities and data. And so one of our Maori collaborators talks about when we're working with data, we have to switch from thinking about who are we talking to instead of who are we talking on behalf of, and how do these data have rights and interests, and what do they mean in particular settings. So that again comes back to these rights to know, these rights to govern, the rights to benefit, and the right to privacy. Lastly, really thinking about Indigenous knowledge and data and kind of infrastructure challenges. And so currently the vast majority of Indigenous data ranges from ethnographic material to biological materials and Earth observations. But none of these are either fair or care principles. So Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. For example, in my own research, I use the CEIU SKUNet to identify specific plant species. And what was really interesting is so many of them talked about certain plants being used for traditional medicines, but they didn't mention which tribal nations or give any credence to that type of knowledge. So if I wanted to go and find my own traditional medicines, I can't do that because it's all under this general tab of Indigenous data. And that's just one example. There are many, many out there. And so it's really important that we think about these researches and kind of go back and tag them and really think about how Indigenous collection and data are not fair and do not perpetrate Indigenous province protocols for use and sharing or permissions across the digital life. And so these are just a few of the examples of kind of thinking about that significant information. So lessons moving forward. It's really important that we evaluate what drives the values of data governance, really thinking about Indigenous ingenuity and core values, looking at what are existing protocols and procedures, particularly on the international level. And I think the Neoga protocol on the access to genetic resources is a really important one, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity. Lastly, thinking about community-driven research that shares capacity with community, and that communities are asking the questions. This includes citing and including Indigenous scholarship, including Indigenous researchers and community researchers as co-authors, and being involved in the review process of manuscript submissions and regulations, making sure that publications are accessible, presenting data to both community and tribal government, and really thinking about how we use science in service to communities and support Indigenous nations fighting for their land sovereignty. Kind of comes back to that first slide, right? And then as we think about quality indicators for responsible research, again, making sure our research is accessible to community members. That's a really common one that many members, cited not being available. Working at how research reportings are relevant to the community concerns, issues, and interests, how are community members credited for their contributions, how is the study report ethical guidelines, particularly around free, prior, and conformed consent, which is part of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. How do the studies address intellectual property and risks for community, really around this cause no harm ethics? And then how do the study report outputs or outcomes to the community? So kind of coming back to that. So ultimately, we really need to recognize the long enduring contributions that Native nations have given to scientific processes, and how they've actually gone through the ultimate peer review process of generations and generations, but have historically gone recognized. And I just kind of look at my own, where I grew up in northern New Mexico, a lot of farming practices and food tradition processes. And then also recognizing that some communities do want to keep their knowledge private, and we have to respect that choice to be unwritten purposefully. So with that, I just want to say thank you for your time. I also really want to acknowledge that I'm speaking on behalf of so many collaborators of the Native Nations Institute, the Collaborative for Indigenous Data, as well as the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And so I'm really thankful to be here today to amplify all of their hard work. And with that, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll applaud on behalf of the, I think, 300 people that are here, which is amazing. That was really inspiring. There are a lot of fantastic resources in here too, and we had a request to kind of get them kind of compiled, which I will do and put them in the description of the YouTube video when the recording goes live so that you can easily access everything that has been shared here. So yeah, with that, I would like to ask, I think the first question, which is something we've been really grappling with here at NCEAS. Here we have a mission to make data as open and accessible to everyone as possible, to democratize science and lower barriers to doing science and facilitate synthesis. And we're thinking about, I think that you could potentially perceive it as a conflict with Indigenous data sovereignty. I don't necessarily think we have to frame it as this either or, but if you have any thoughts on how we can reconcile the goals of open data, with the goals of Indigenous data governance and sovereignty.
Right, so I think first recognizing that Native peoples were not stakeholders, we're rights holders. We have very different types of rights to our data and our knowledge systems, right? So I think like if a Native nation decides they don't want to do something, respecting that, because there has to be this big process of building up relationships. I didn't even go into some of the aspects that historically how Native nations trust has been really tarnished by colonial science practices. And the Havasupai case is a really important example of really tarnishing that trust. So this process of collaborating and building trust with Native nations and researchers and communities is going to be a really important part of that. And I think that's exactly why we have the fair and care principles to try to implement those and really begin to guide those practices to build up that community consent and practice. But it's going to be a pathway because we're dealing with over 500 years of colonization impacting our communities in such negative ways.
Thank you for that. No, I think it's a long process. I think it's not going to happen overnight. So I think that's a great point. Yeah. Okay. So
one thing I want to add to that too, right, is I think a lot of scientists right now, and especially in ecological studies, are really wanting to begin partnerships with tribal nations, but many haven't built up those relationships. And really, when we look at the standard granting cycle, it's maybe 2 or 5 years, sometimes 10 years, right? And that's really in building a relationship, that's a pretty short timeline. And so I think that's another push also for granting agencies to really recognize in these types of collaborative consent building practices, it's going to take a lot longer than going into the field and collecting specific microbial samples, for example. And so I just also wanted to really highlight that.
Yeah, and I think it gets to a point that's come up earlier too, is just how can we change the incentive structures in academic research to not prioritize productivity as quickly as possible, but to really value relationship building and this kind of meaningful engagement, as well as just cranking out papers and collecting data. So. Great. Our next question was a little bit more, I guess, specific. If you have any suggestions of resources to learn about how to implement metadata structure for Indigenous data sovereignty.
Yeah, so I believe our Global Indigenous Data Alliance, as well as our US Indigenous Data Sovereignty groups do have, so they've worked a lot more on particularly some of those governance structures for genetic samples. I think some of the frameworks aren't currently in place quite as much for ecological systems, although we are currently working on that.
Thanks. Yeah, and we'll share some links to all of these different organizations as well. So this is a question for non-Indigenous researchers who are interested in collaborating with Indigenous scholars, communities, and tribal governments. Can you talk about best practices for engaging in proactive conversations about data sovereignty and governance? How to build those relationships. Maybe when you don't really have a starting place. Where to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think learning about the tribal nations that are in your area, and I think one of the first slides was the overview of the tribes and the native lands .canada from .ca. So they're a really great place to begin to learn about the lands that you're on and work with. They also have on there, links to the websites of the tribal nations in your area. And so I think that's an important part. But I also think it's really important to note that often there might be 1 or 2 environmental managers of a community. And so it really begins with building relationships. And so, I've seen a practice of a professor here at my institution where he really wants to work, and he's he's an aquatic ecologist and really wants to work with tribal nations, but he's just been going for a couple of years now to be like, hey, this is my skill set that I have. If you ever have any questions, I'm here, and I would love to support you in any way possible. So really like going back every year and building that relationship. And now he says after I think it's been 4 or 5 years, it's starting to get people reaching out to him. And so recognizing again that it takes time, but and not necessarily hitting up, hey, I have this grant money, I want to do this. That's not really the right approach, at least in many of the people that we have continued to talk to. So.
Yeah, and I think that again, recognizing that trust doesn't come overnight, and I think that I can link to this too. But there was I recently went to the Unlearning Racism in Geoscience, had a great session on meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities, and I forget the name of the speaker, but acknowledge that when you come to a group and say, here's a question that I think is important, can you help me with it? That's not often a great starting point, but that building relationships and then co-creating questions. What are the questions that are important to you, and where does my expertise fit in, can be perhaps a better starting point. But acknowledging that it maybe doesn't happen on the timescale of a master's thesis, that these relationships do take time.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in my own PhD, I wanted to work with one of the neighboring tribal nations more directly, and I kind of did the same thing. Like, this is my skill set, this is what I'm interested in doing, but I'm curious what your questions are. And it was kind of like, well, that's cool. Like, maybe we'll hire you in the future, but that's just not where our concerns are right now. And so even as an Indigenous researcher who works with other nations, I think it's just important that like it happens to all of us, and it is just part of that practice. Some are going to say no, just like some don't want their information shared, and it's respecting that, because that's part of sovereignty, right?
Right. Follow question to that, someone's asking, are there good examples that you can point to, like cases, collaborative research endeavors that you think are working well?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. So University of Arizona has a fair amount, but there is some work by Dr. Carletta Chief. And so she is from the Navajo Nation, but she's also worked with her own community, specifically in relation to the Gold King mine spill that happened in 2014. And so really how her partnership with the tribal communities, it's expanded because it was so successful. And so now she's also bringing many like non-Indigenous researchers in partnership with her, because she's built that trust with her own community, right, to be able to kind of do those kinds of research projects. And I'd have to think a little bit more about non-Indigenous led ones. I know there are definitely some examples, but I'm missing them at the moment. So.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and we can always follow up if there are other things you think of after the call. Another question, how can scholars of color support or join these data groups like GIDA? Do we have to attend graduate school to be involved with these efforts, or how do you see more points of entry recognizing higher education retention challenges?
Yeah, so I think with the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Group, we have an email list, so we send out opportunities and things like that for types of trainings. Try to make as many of our resources as possible available online, so people continue to learn and think about that. Because again, though this is being developed in academic spaces, really we're trying to push future policy that protects all of our knowledge systems. And so working with community partners is inherently important for us. And so I think also, I'm definitely talking more about Indigenous communities, but a lot of this relates to Black communities and Latino communities, immigrant communities, right? And how these different policies impact those communities quite differently. And so, yes, I definitely encourage you to follow and check out some of our website resources and contact us. If we have questions, we're going to try to do our best to work with and answer those. So.
Great, thank you. Next question is asking for some more examples of best practices, but specifically in relation to databases or repositories that make their collections accessible to Indigenous communities, if there are any you can think of.
Yeah, I have to think about that more deeply as well. I think there's a fair amount of databases that are really trying to do that and are also kind of going back through and looking at some of these colonial notions that they've had. And so, we are just working and talking with some of the researchers at ASU and that NEON database. And so I think they'll be having a paper in the upcoming future for that. I think the GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, has a couple more prolific examples, particularly in very international settings, because talking about Indigenous data sovereignty in some European countries is a little more sparse, right? Beyond like some people like the Sami. And so I think they also have some really great examples of that. But definitely go through and read the FAIR and CARE papers. We are working with a variety of major scientific organizations to really start implementing this. So I think it's really important to note that a lot of this FAIR and CARE principles and talking about Indigenous data, this has taken a long time to get these concepts to the forefront, whereas now I think 2020 and 2021, we're really like wanting to support them and push that, but it's taken a long time even just to fight for the recognition of them. And so you will see in the next couple of years really more examples of these good practices or good methods in practice, right?
Thank you. Okay, this is a big question. Let's see if it sparks any ideas. That how can we pair and blend Earth jurisprudence, the inherent rights of nature, the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, and move legally towards building a progressive, relevant, and innovative Indigenous data sovereignty? What does a radical future look like?
I mean, I think there's been some really powerful work by both Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I think she's Swamish mission, but so she's given TED Talks and has been writing for years about the personhood of nature, right? And also how Indigenous peoples with these long relationships of stewarding these lands have kind of sitting in this position of voicing for nature, which can't always talk in quite the same capacity, right? So I think that's really powerful to go watch her TED Talk. And then also Dr. Kalua Fox, and he is more of a geneticist, but I think he's also doing some really good work about talking about the personhood of data and also how we make this data more accessible from a genetic perspective. And so I think those are both really important people as we are talking about the rights of nature. And we're seeing it happening in so many, it began really in Australia and talking about the rights of people, but that we've seen in India and now even I believe it's Minnesota, and some communities there talking about the rights of nature and the rights of water systems. And I am really excited to continue to see where that's going, particularly as we see the lawsuit of, I think it was 18 youth who are suing the US government for basically diminishing their future because they're not addressing climate change. So all of those are so inherently linked, and it's really exciting to see what our youth in particular are doing. Hopefully that answered the question. I know that was a little bit.
No, that's fantastic. I'm inspired by the youth. I feel like the future's in good hands. This next question is just shifting gears a little bit. Marielle is curious for your thoughts on the use of land acknowledgements during scientific presentations or in the acknowledgement sections of publications. And specifically, what would you advise research groups who are doing really theoretical work that maybe isn't necessarily grounded in conservation and land management to ensure that they're not just empty gestures?
Yeah, I mean, land acknowledgements are great, but they're just a starting point. That's great that you know about the lands that you're on, but how are you dismantling the power inequities associated with them? So that is exactly why I talk about all of these policies that have been in place for so long, because how come we haven't been taught about those as we talk about ecological practices, right? And so I think what's really important, it's great that institutions and conferences are giving land acknowledgements, but how are they bringing those students from underrepresented and really communities that have been marginalized and silenced in their science acknowledgement, just like I talked about, Indigenous knowledge systems not being considered valid historically or in the past. How are they changing those practices? How are they making space and encouraging and sponsoring those students to be in these places? And how are they funding? I think funding is going to be a really important part. How are they funding projects that are actually promoting those types of science practices? And I have so many friends, I haven't quite gone through this process yet, but I have so many friends who have horror stories of them being told that traditional ecological knowledge isn't valid science, that should go to a social sciences paper. And that includes in theoretical studies as mathematics and talking about cultural methods of teaching math, right? And so I think it's really important that we are moving much more beyond acknowledging lands, but we're also dismantling these systems that make this inequity possible. So I guess I'll just stop there.
Thank you. This question is a little specific. I'll ask it and see if you understand it better than I do. Do you know of any indicators that have been submitted to the post-2020 biodiversity framework related to Indigenous indicators, or have any recommendations?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that means.
Okay.
I like to think it means like biological indicators. There's a researcher at the University of Washington, Jamie Donatuto, who's worked, I believe, with Squamish, maybe Squamish tribal nation, but really actually looking at, I believe fish contamination. And so they've used cultural knowledge, but also developed these microbial indicators to kind of talk about environmental pollution. And so I think that's, you know, a really powerful one. I also think, you know, we've talked a lot in the last year about intersectionality. And so I think talking about the intersectionality, not only of different race identities, but also different gender identities, and how those are being inherently impacted differently by climate change and environmental pollution. So there's actually a really exciting group that's working for COP26, and they're actually looking at the intersections of climate change and women and how we're inherently being more impacted by climate change, particularly women of color, than other groups. And so I think that's going to be really exciting, using artistic forms in addition to science. So
Great.
Sorry, I wasn't answering.
And we'll send all these questions. We'll share them with you as well in case there's anything, you know, that sparks any further ideas or people want to follow up. But another question, we have time for a few more questions. Great. If you have any reflections on how the situation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has affected, you know, these efforts, whether it's collaboration with Indigenous nations or Indigenous data sovereignty, how has the pandemic changed the way we think about it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you for answering it. I think, so I present today very much on ecological information, but I think 2020 and the pandemic has really highlighted how much there's digital invisibility and data invisibility of Native peoples. And so it's been really critical that we've had Native people working in these topics, because for a while, health data was not reporting about Indigenous numbers and how their populations were being impacted. And when we started to get that information, we saw that actually Native people were the ones that were being most impacted by COVID. And then as we started to tease out why that is, it came down to a lot of these structural inequities of access to information, making sure that information was put in a cultural relevant way and put in language. And then also, as we looked at vaccinations, a lot of cultural mistrust, because vaccinations were historically against Native women were forced sterilization. So I think all of those aspects of understanding the history, understanding the data invisibility and how that can be interpreted as being intentional, but then also how the critical importance of Indigenous scholarship to highlight these issues, but also to build trust in communities, have all really been highlighted throughout COVID. In a more practical sense, a lot of our collaborators are international. So I think for a fair amount of us, doing Zoom meetings was pretty normalized, but I think it just heightened how critically important data sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge pathways and systems are. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, yeah, I just actually saw an article in the Atlantic today about how the pandemic has kind of made field researchers question doing parachute science too. And this is a little bit of a different angle on that question, but you know, that actually empowering people on the ground to conduct their own research as opposed to coming in and doing research, and especially in other countries, is perhaps better in many ways. And that the pandemic has kind of shown us that that is perhaps, you know, possible and preferable.
Can I just like add on to that? Actually,
yeah.
It's really important because parachute science, now that I'm working more in a public health department, parachute science is a really common topic that's trained in their practices. But that's not something that we tend to talk about quite as much in ecological sciences, which I think is really fascinating, right? That we're not necessarily trained to work as much with on-the-ground researchers as public health is. And so I think that kind of comes back to some of these colonial roots of traveling to exotic places and discovering things there, but not sharing with the people, not, you know, talking to local experts. And many of my Indigenous colleagues often talk about this Columbusing of data. Like, oh, look, they like showed that like we are, you know, they could have asked us, like we have oral history about that. And so I think it's really important that as we are working to decolonize and what I say indigenize our science practices, that we really kind of address some of those core tenets that we've been trained, or predecessors have been trained, and really dismantle those. So thank you for bringing up also helicopter science.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of thinking about how we can push back against norms, maybe the last question we have time for, and apologies, we didn't get to many of your questions, is if you have any recommendations for graduate students or junior researchers on how to push forward co-creation of questions with Indigenous communities, while also still working within the research aims and questions that your supervisor may have. We had another question too about, how to push back against maybe more resilient senior colleagues into acknowledging data sovereignty.
Yeah, this is something I also in my PhD, because I was working on mining reclamation and it was very biotechnical. And it was really where I found a lot of comfort in pursuing a minor in American Indian policy. And part of that was because I was learning very different methods of data collection and kind of this reciprocal relationship with our research questions. So I do think that there is a power in kind of minoring in ethnic studies or social sciences to really kind of round out that practice. But I also think there's so much power that I'm seeing in some of the scholars since I've graduated really pushing to make their science more equitable. And so as far as how to manage it, I think for me, it really came to finding mentorship in a group that was really Indigenous focused. Sorry, my dog is coughing. That is really focused. And then also, I'm so sorry. And then also, I think that there is just a big shift that's happening of how we're asking questions and a lot of awakening. And so continuing to support and promote and push and ask for different types of environmental justice training, asking questions on why a panel is all white or all male, recognizing the critical importance of different gender identities and how their intersections, we have to make sure, we have to be constantly asking who's not at the table and who are asking these questions and how can these questions be harmful or how can they be ways that question power inequities. So I hope that helps.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, I would say also, I would encourage people to, as we close, we'll be sending around a link to this talk. So share it with your supervisors. If there are any, papers that we'll link to the papers that were cited here, send them around and ask if you want to have a journal club or a lab meeting to talk through some of these ideas. Just open up the conversation and within your communities. And I hope we can each take this talk and carry it forward and pass it along to our collaborators and colleagues. And this will really be the starting point. I'm seeing a lot of expressions of gratitude in the chat. If anyone wants to drop any other messages to Dr. Jennings, we'll export all of them and pass them along to her. And they won't, yeah, go ahead.
Too, and having journal clubs is great, but we can do lots of reading, but how are we assimilating that and putting it into practice? And I think that's really important. We are all scientists, you read lots of papers, but how are we putting it into practice? How is it informing and changing those practices that we've done? And so I think that's the other part, like reading is not enough and it's constantly challenging. And I myself have to do this. We constantly have to really challenge what our conventions are and what is the language that we're using, right? Like I'm a soil microbiologist. So like the term of microbial colonization is something that's really utilized, but like it makes me really uncomfortable, right? And I'm sure there are many terms for other ethnic groups and identities that make them uncomfortable. And so like, let's challenge and change that, this colonial narrative and history that our practices have. So
I like that. Yes. Thinking about how we can translate these ideas into actions. And then recognizing that a lot of these things there's things we can start doing tomorrow and then other things that are going to be a lifelong process. So yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, and thanks to the many of you who joined. We'll send resources, we'll get this up online and try and get as many resources compiled for easy sharing. Ben, is there anything you wanted to say to kind of close us out, take us home?
Just a huge thank you, Lydia, and to everyone who joined, and we look forward to following your work and on top of it. So thank you.
Right, yeah, hopefully getting you out here to NCs for a working group at some point.